Loneliness has become one of the defining experiences of our age. We live in crowded cities, we scroll endlessly through oceans of faces on glowing screens, we carry devices that connect us to millions of people at any second, yet inside, there is a silence that feels unbearable. It is a silence that even conversation cannot fully break, a distance that even intimacy sometimes cannot cross. And it is precisely this paradox that Carl Jung understood long before our world was filled with smartphones and social networks. That loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of connection to one's own soul. Jung wrote that the greatest burden a person must bear is to live a life that is not truly theirs. This, he believed, is the root of the loneliness that haunts us. Surrounded by others, we may wear the masks expected of us, being agreeable, successful, entertaining, useful. But beneath these masks, if we have never discovered who we really are, every encounter feels hollow. We can be in a room filled with laughter and still feel a weight pressing on our chest, because the laughter is not ours, not born from the place of truth inside us. Jung called this inner truth the self, the deeper center of being that the ego constantly avoids. What makes his insight timeless is that it speaks to the very condition of modern life. We have achieved what earlier generations could barely imagine, a world in which we are never truly alone. At any moment, we can check in with others, share our thoughts instantly, seek validation with a tap of a screen. Yet Jung would say that the more we rush to avoid solitude, the more it stalks us. Because in trying to escape the inner emptiness, we only tighten its grip. For Jung, the individual who cannot sit with their own company is condemned to wander restlessly, always in search of an external cure for an internal wound. To understand this, Jung drew from his patience, from myth, from his own struggles. He once confessed that his loneliest hours were not when he lacked company, but when he was forced to confront the vastness of his own unconscious. He described it as standing on the shore of a dark sea, knowing that beneath its surface were forces larger than anything he could control. It was in these moments that he realized the truth. Loneliness is not defeated by the crowd, it is transformed only by dialogue with the depths of the psyche. This is why Jung gave such importance to dreams, to symbols, to the images that arise when we stop running from ourselves. He saw them as messages from the unconscious, attempts of the self to reach the ego, and reminded of what has been forgotten. When we ignore these messages, we become estranged from our own inner life, and that estrangement is what no amount of external companionship can cure. People may sit beside us, hold us, even love us, but if we remain cut off from the river of meaning within, their presence cannot quench the thirst. He often warned of what he called the cult of adaptation, the pressure to adjust ourselves endlessly to the expectations of society. The more we adapt, the more successful we might appear, but the more the soul withers in silence. And when the soul grows silent, loneliness appears like a shadow, whispering that something essential is missing. This is why so many today, despite wealth or fame or a calendar filled with meetings, still speak of a strange emptiness at the core of their lives. Jung would say that emptiness is not a flaw, but a signal, an urgent message that the self is waiting to be found. For him, the cure was not in retreating from society altogether, nor in drowning ourselves in endless interaction. It was in the quiet and often painful work of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of reconciling the conscious self with the unconscious depths. Individuation, Jung insisted, is not a luxury. It is the only way to live without the constant ache of loneliness. Because once the inner world is reconciled, even solitude becomes rich, and even company becomes meaningful. In this light, the modern epidemic of loneliness is not simply a social problem. It is a spiritual problem, a failure of the inner dialogue. We keep adding more voices from the outside, hoping they will fill the silence inside, but Jung reminds us that until we listen inward, the silence will remain. To feel truly at home in the world, one must first feel at home in the depths of the psyche. And perhaps that is the most comforting message hidden in his thought, that loneliness is not a life sentence, but a doorway. It is the signal that we have strayed too far from our center, and that the path forward is not outward but inward, into the vast, untamed forest of the soul. It is there, Jung believed, that we will discover that the loneliness haunting us is not an enemy, but a guide. Loneliness, Jung believed, is not a mistake in the human experience, but an unavoidable threshold that every soul must cross. When we feel it rising inside us, when even familiar faces seem distant, it is not proof that life has failed us. It is proof that life is asking us to pay attention. To Jung, the ache of loneliness was a summons from the unconscious, a demand that the individual step beyond the shallow roles of society and encounter the depths of their own being. He understood that most people are terrified of this call. We busy ourselves with noise, with schedules, with endless streams of distraction, because to sit in silence is to face what we have buried. The modern world, with its constant connectivity, makes this easier than ever. We can lose ourselves in the chatter of others, in the lives flashing across our screens, in the illusion of closeness without intimacy. Yet Jung would say that such closeness is fragile. It collapses in moments of crisis, and then the loneliness returns with even greater force, reminding us that it had never truly left. What makes Jung's insight so profound is that he did not see loneliness as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. To him, it was a sign that the ego and the self were divided. The ego, our everyday identity, strives for approval, status, and belonging. But the self, that deeper wholeness of the psyche, demands authenticity, integration, and truth. When these two are at odds, a person feels torn from the inside. Surrounded by people, one still feels unseen, because the truest parts of the soul are not allowed into the light. Jung often wrote about what he called the shadow, the collection of traits and desires that we repress because they do not fit the image we wish to show the world. These shadow elements do not disappear simply because we push them away. They continue to live inside us, growing restless, shaping our moods, and deepening our sense of isolation. For the person who never turns inward, loneliness is magnified by this hidden war within the psyche. It is not just that others do not understand us. It is that we do not understand ourselves. This is why Jung urged people to embrace the work of self-exploration. He encouraged them to write down their dreams, to paint the images that rose from their imagination, to sit with their emotions rather than flee from them. Such practices were not hobbies. They were acts of reconciliation, attempts to bring the hidden parts of the self back into conversation with the conscious mind. And in doing so, loneliness could shift. It could transform from an unbearable emptiness into a creative tension, a space in which something new could emerge. In his own life, Jung faced periods of profound solitude. After his break with Freud, he entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a time when he withdrew from many of his professional duties and immersed himself in the strange visions and fantasies that filled his mind. From the outside, it might have looked like madness, or at least isolation. Yet for Jung, this period was the foundation of his later philosophy. He discovered that when one enters deeply into solitude, the psyche responds. Images arise, symbols appear, and the loneliness begins to speak in its own language. It is no longer a silent void, but a dialogue with the depths. This idea changes how we see our own loneliness today. Instead of treating it as a flaw to be erased, we might see it as a companion pointing toward what is missing. If we listen carefully, it tells us which parts of ourselves have been abandoned. Perhaps it reminds us of a creativity long suppressed, or a longing for meaning buried beneath the duties of survival. Perhaps it speaks of grief we never allowed ourselves to feel, or of love we have denied ourselves in order to appear strong. Loneliness is not only pain, it is also memory. It remembers the parts of us that remain unmet. And so Jung did not tell people to escape loneliness by drowning themselves in the crowd. He urged them to make solitude conscious, to engage with it deliberately. In doing so, they could discover that the world within them was not barren but fertile, alive with possibilities that had been waiting to be noticed. Only from this place of inner dialogue could a person truly step back into the outer world and feel at home among others. Because then, connection would not be driven by need or desperation, but by wholeness. It is a demanding path, but Jung believed it was the only path that led to true community. For without inner reconciliation, every relationship remains haunted by the unspoken, by the unresolved, by the loneliness we carry in secret. To find ourselves is therefore the first act of love. Only then does the company of others cease to be a distraction from loneliness and become a deep sharing of life. Jung believed that loneliness, when endured with patience, becomes the soil out of which creativity and meaning can grow. It is not a comfortable soil. It feels barren, desolate, even hostile. Yet it is within that inner desert that the psyche begins to speak in symbols, offering images and ideas that can only arise in silence. Many of the world's greatest works of art, literature, and philosophy, Jung observed, were born not from contentment but from the profound solitude of those who dared to face their own depths. For Jung, the unconscious was not just a storehouse of forgotten memories. It was a living wellspring of imagination, endlessly producing forms, stories, and visions that sought expression. When a person withdraws from the noise of the crowd and enters solitude, they begin to hear the voice of this inner world. At first it may sound chaotic or frightening. Dreams may disturb, fantasies may unsettle, emotions may rise without warning. But Jung insisted that within this apparent chaos lies order, within the strangeness lies guidance. The psyche, he believed, is always moving toward wholeness, and it uses loneliness to push us inward so that we might receive the images that can heal and transform us. He himself embodied this process. During the years after his split with Freud, when he endured what seemed to be overwhelming isolation, Jung began to paint, to write, to let the strange figures of his inner world come forth onto paper. What resulted was the Red Book, a vast collection of visions, dialogues, and symbolic images that would remain hidden for decades but which he considered the foundation of his later psychology. Out of loneliness came creation. Out of solitude came meaning. He did not escape the emptiness by seeking distraction, but by listening until the emptiness began to speak. This insight reveals why so many people today feel both restless and unfulfilled. In our culture, loneliness is seen only as a problem to be eliminated. We are taught to chase stimulation, to fill every gap with entertainment or company, to silence the inner voice before it can unsettle us. But Jung saw this as a tragic mistake. For it is precisely when we fall into silence, when the masks fall away, that we encounter the raw material of creativity. The artist, the thinker, the visionary, all are shaped not by avoiding loneliness but by dwelling in it long enough to hear what it has to say. And this is not limited to art. Jung believed that every human being, whether or not they consider themselves creative, is called to shape meaning from their inner life. The dreams, symbols, and feelings that arise in solitude are not accidents, they are invitations. They point to paths we might take, values we might reclaim, aspects of ourselves we might integrate. To ignore them is to remain trapped in a shallow existence, always surrounded yet always unsatisfied. To listen to them is to begin the process of individuation, the journey of becoming whole. There is, however, a danger in this process, and Jung knew it well. Too much isolation without guidance can overwhelm a person. The unconscious is powerful, and if its images are not balanced with consciousness, one can be swept away. This is why he stressed the importance of bringing inner experiences into some form, writing them, painting them, shaping them into ritual or story, so that they become bridges rather than floods. In this way, loneliness is not an abyss but a workshop, where raw emotion is transformed into something that can be shared. And here lies a paradox that Jung illuminated. True connection with others can only emerge from this inner work. When we create from the depths of our solitude, we produce something that resonates universally, something others recognize as their own hidden truth. The writer who reveals their private despair gives voice to countless others. The painter who dares to depict the shadows of the soul allows others to see their own darkness reflected. Out of loneliness comes the possibility of communion, not the shallow communion of surface chatter, but the profound communion of shared meaning. Thus, loneliness is not simply an obstacle to be overcome. It is a threshold to be crossed. It asks us to suffer its silence long enough to find what lies beneath. And when we do, what once felt like a wound begins to feel like a source. The loneliness that seemed unbearable becomes the very place from which life flows again. For Jung, loneliness was never only a psychological issue. It was also a spiritual calling. Beneath the ache of isolation, he sensed the human longing for connection with something greater than the personal self, something vast, timeless, and eternal. He believed that every soul carries within it an innate orientation toward the sacred, and that the pain of loneliness often arises when this connection is broken or ignored. In this sense, the loneliness of modern man was not merely social disconnection. It was the hunger for transcendence in a world that had forgotten how to honor it. Jung often wrote that modern people suffered from what he called a loss of soul. By this he meant that in the pursuit of progress, technology, and external achievement, the inner world had been neglected, and with it the sense of belonging to a larger order of existence. Religion, once a source of shared symbols and meaning, had lost much of its authority in the West. But in discarding it, many individuals were left stranded, no longer held by myths or rituals that could anchor the psyche in a cosmos of meaning. What replaced it was a culture of materialism and shallow diversions. And in this culture, Jung observed, loneliness grew like a hidden epidemic. He was not calling for a return to dogma or to unthinking belief. Instead, he urged people to rediscover the symbolic life. He believed that the unconscious continually produces images that point beyond the ego to the realm of the sacred. Dreams filled with archetypal figures, visions of light and shadow, even the sense of awe one feels in the presence of nature, all of these were, to Jung, signs of the psyche reaching toward the divine. If a person could learn to read these symbols, loneliness could transform into a spiritual dialogue. One would no longer feel abandoned in a meaningless universe, but rather addressed by it, spoken to by something greater. This is why Jung said that the individual who has no contact with the unconscious is cut off from the source of life itself. Without this contact, people drift, endlessly seeking fulfillment in others yet never finding it. But with it, even solitude becomes filled with presence. One begins to feel accompanied by something larger, whether it is named God, the self, or simply the mystery of existence. In that presence, loneliness softens, because the soul recognizes that it is not truly alone. Jung himself found this in his own encounters with the unconscious. During his visions, he experienced figures that seemed to carry wisdom far beyond his personal mind. He described conversations with inner guides, presences that felt as real to him as any human teacher. He did not insist that these figures were literal beings. What mattered was that they carried meaning, that they revealed dimensions of the psyche connected to the collective experience of humanity. In listening to them, he felt less isolated, for he realized that the depths of his soul were linked to something universal. This is why he argued that loneliness is, at its core, the feeling of being disconnected from the whole. We suffer not because we are physically alone, but because we feel spiritually severed, severed from others, severed from nature, severed from the divine ground of being. To heal loneliness, then, is not simply to add more company. It is to rediscover the invisible bonds that unite us to all life. It is to awaken to the archetypes, the eternal patterns of the psyche, that remind us we are part of a greater story unfolding across generations. Such a vision changes the way one experiences solitude. Instead of emptiness, solitude becomes sacred space. It becomes the temple where the soul can hear its deepest truths. In this space, silence itself becomes meaningful, because it carries the resonance of something eternal. And from this silence, one can return to others with a new kind of presence, not demanding that they fill an inner void, but offering companionship born from a place of inner fullness. Loneliness, then, is not simply a psychological wound but a spiritual doorway. It asks us to step beyond the shallow noise of daily life and to encounter the mystery that surrounds us. To deny it is to remain restless and disconnected. To accept it is to find that even in solitude, we are profoundly accompanied by the depths of our own soul and by the eternal patterns that link us to the whole of existence. To Jung, the pain of loneliness was never meant to be the end of the story. It was the beginning of transformation. He saw it as the summons that pulls us away from shallow existence, away from the endless chase for approval and distraction, and into the deeper work of becoming whole. Every ache of isolation, he believed, is the psyche reminding us that something essential waits to be acknowledged, that the dialogue with the self has fallen silent and must be renewed. What makes his vision so enduring is that it refuses both extremes, the denial of loneliness through constant noise, and the despair that comes from believing it is permanent. Instead, he places loneliness at the very heart of individuation. To enter solitude consciously is to discover that the emptiness conceals a hidden fullness. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes alive with dreams, symbols, and intuitions. The shadow that once frightened us becomes the source of new strength. And the longing that once seemed endless becomes a bridge to something larger, something sacred. Jung never promised that this path would be easy. To face loneliness honestly is to face our own wounds, our own forgotten desires, our own vulnerability. It means admitting that the masks we wear, however polished, do not protect us from the truths buried beneath. But he also knew that no true healing occurs without this confrontation. A life spent avoiding loneliness is a life spent avoiding oneself. And such avoidance, however full of activity, will always feel hollow. The reward of this work is a new way of being in the world. Once the inner dialogue is restored, once the ego and the self are in conversation again, a profound shift occurs. Solitude no longer feels like exile but like home. Other people are no longer sought to fill an emptiness but are met as fellow travelers, each carrying their own depths. Love becomes freer, because it is no longer rooted in desperation. Community becomes richer, because it is no longer built on masks. Even silence between people begins to carry meaning, because it is shared from a place of wholeness. In the end, Jung saw loneliness not as an enemy but as a guide. It is the teacher that strips away illusions, the companion that refuses to be silenced until we turn inward, the threshold that every soul must cross to enter the fullness of its own life. In its grip, we may feel abandoned, but if we listen, we find that it is leading us back to ourselves, back to meaning, back to the mysterious ground of being from which no one is ever truly separate. And so the message is both sobering and comforting. Sobering, because loneliness will touch every life, and there is no escape through distraction alone. Comforting, because within it lies the very key to healing, creativity, and connection. Jung's insight reminds us that the loneliness we feel in a world full of people is not proof that something is wrong with us. It is proof that something deep within us is still alive, still reaching, still calling us toward the wholeness we have yet to claim. To answer that call is to walk a path few choose, but it is also the path that leads from emptiness to meaning, from isolation to belonging, from the ache of separation to the quiet fullness of the soul at peace with itself.